In this segment, we're going to take a look at an inspiring story, even though it started off really rough. Casey Gerald, he came from a broken home. His mother left when he was only 12. His father, he went to jail for drugs. But that's far from the end of his story. He overcame all of that, and he attended Yale, then got an MBA at Harvard, became a successful businessman. It all started when he delivered a TED Talk that went viral, and he took it from there. Here's part of that.
I held on when I arrived at Yale at 18 with the faith that my journey from Oak Cliff, Texas was a chance to leave behind all the challenges I had known, the broken dreams and broken bodies I had seen. But when I found myself back home one winter break with my face planted in the floor and my hands tied behind my back and a burglar's gun pressed to my head, I knew that even the best education couldn't save me.
Gerald talks about his life in a new memoir called There Will Be No Miracles Here. I spoke with him a short time ago. Take this as a compliment, but you're impossible to interview, to put this entire life story with so many different amazing chapters, and it doesn't run like a biography because you basically tell everybody, don't follow my path necessarily at the end, and this is not the end goal. So let me try and figure a starting place. New Year's Eve, 1999. You're sitting in a church waiting for the great rapture that doesn't come. Talk about what you were like then, I guess, as a 12-year-old kid, and why that night or non-night was such a pivotal moment in your life.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I start the book with this scene of waiting for Jesus to come back, December 31st, 1989. I believed at 12 that at midnight I'd be either caught up in the rapture or would be damned to eternity, to hell for all eternity. And this was very terrifying, but also very important. And what I realized in writing the book, that it was less about a religious question of salvation and eternity, and more about a human question of being rescued. My whole life had fallen apart. My mother was starting to disappear. My father was gone. I was living in this, neighborhood. And I write in the book, I didn't want the world to end. I wanted to be rescued. And so what this book really is doing, it's not just a memoir. A Brit read it and said what I really felt I was doing was reading a history of America. I think both my life and this country in some ways came to a dead end, right? In 2016, 2017, even up till today. And what I'm trying to do with this book, as someone who has lived America from the very bottom to the very top, is to report back and to say, hey, this is how we got here. And this is where we are, and hopefully turn this sort of American dream narrative on its head, because I think it's time for us to wake up from this dream that actually is doing a lot more damage than it is doing good.
I got to go through some of the sign points of your life,
Yeah.
And then I want to get to your thoughts of where we are and where we should go. You mentioned your mom just disappeared from your life. And in fact, you write in there, if you gave a choice to know if you have a parent who's dead or one that's missing, choose dead every single time because of the uncertainty of it. Your father, football star at Ohio State, ends up getting in trouble with addictions, and he goes away to prison. Your sister, probably as big a hero in this book as anywhere. She went off to college, came home, and literally it was you two. And you had to figure out stuff on the fly as you went along.
Part of what I'm trying to do here is sort of trouble these villain hero narratives. Up until I wrote the book, I thought my mother disappeared when I was 12, and then I started writing. I realized she actually disappeared when I was 13. There was a whole year of the worst thing that ever happened to me that I just didn't remember. And so part of my job as a writer was to try not to convince you that I know everything, but try to bring language to this absence of memory. And in doing that, I was able to realize that the worst thing that ever happened to me was the most important thing that ever happened to my mother. She suffered from mental illness, from bipolar, and this was back when, this was just not talked about,
Yep.
Not understood in any kind of way. And she was so failed by us, her family, by the psychiatric hospitals, and one day she just up and left. And I had to come to see my mother not as my employee, but as a human being. And similarly with my father, the only story I got was that here was this kid. who threw away his life for drugs. He had once been seen as one of the greatest high school football players in the history of the state of Texas. He goes off to Ohio State, and by the time I'm a kid, all we see is this story, once the pride of Texas, South Oak Cliff star, sacks his life with drugs. Well, it turns out, in researching the book, what I found was the first time he took cocaine was to play in the 1977 Orange Bowl for Ohio State. He had broken his back earlier in the season, and a guy comes before the game and says, "Do you want me to give you something that'll make you play like a champion today?" And he takes it. He was a 20-year-old kid. So it's not just that my sister is a hero. It's not that she did what she did. She's a saint in a lot of ways. But so much of what I'm trying to do, whether it's with my parents, whether it's with this country, I'm trying to really trouble the narratives we've been given, because that's keeping us from actually seeing the truth.
In fact, you write, you go to Yale. You were not a prodigy as a young man and a football player. You go to Yale, you excel, and you would expect, if it follows the normal narrative, go to Yale, this is the American story, but you said you get there and you found within black students there was a divide here, and where you would have thought you would have gone for support, you didn't find it.
Yeah, I just put out this story, an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday, 2 days ago, that's really getting to what I'm trying to talk about with the American dream. That you take a kid like me from a forgotten community like Oak Cliff, Texas, and you send him off to Yale, and you say, "Oh, hey, let's celebrate. If he did it, every kid can do it." Well, the reality is, one, that's not true, and we'll talk more about that. But more importantly, the reality is that is a very harrowing and painful and lonely experience for a kid like me to go from the world that I was raised in to a world like Yale. And so I said some of this in the New York Times piece, and what's been so striking is that I've gotten messages from white folks who have gone through that experience, from Hispanic folks who have gone through that experience, from Asian folks who have gone through that experience. It is a broad, in some ways, reality of poor children of every race and every ethnicity, that they are ill-supported, ill-prepared, and they go into environments where they're asked to become totally different people. And they say, "Hey, we're going to give you the keys to the kingdom as long as you leave pieces of yourself behind." And I think that's a bargain that we can't afford to ask children to take in this country anymore.
It's funny, the author of Hillbilly Elegy had kind of the same experience when he went off to Ivy League school.
Well, but let's be clear. Now, JD and I greatly respect JD's life and his work. But, JD blames, in a lot of ways, a sort of culture of poverty for what's going on in his town of Appalachia. Well, I worked through MBAs Across America, nonprofit I ran in places like Appalachia and rural Montana, not just in urban places like Oak Cliff. And what I know is that it is quite lazy, if not perverse, to blame culture for the fact that 13 million children in America of every ethnicity, including in Appalachia, live in households without enough food to eat. That 1 in 30 children don't have a stable household at all. So I think JD and I are definitely coming out of the same similar experiences, but we're coming to very radically different conclusions. And I think those conflicting conclusions really shape the debate that we've got to have in this country.
And we'll be right back to wrap things up.